A new sophisticated iOS spyware was just identified in the wild, making use of 5 full exploit chains and targeting a huge range of Apple devices. And today in this video, I'm going to infect one of my personal iPhones so that we can actually analyze what happens when you visit one of the malicious websites, giving us a very rare glimpse into the world of mobile exploitation. This particular exploit toolkit, internally known as Coruna, gained a lot of public attention recently after both Google's threat analysis group and iVerify published their research into this malware campaign. Google states that they'd been tracking the use of this exploit chain throughout 2025 and that it was originally being deployed as spyware by a suspected Russian espionage group. However, more recently, the same exploits were found to be deployed by a financially motivated group operating from China. To my surprise, after speaking to some other iOS researchers who were also interested in this chain, it turns out that some of the links serving the spyware were actually still active and could be still used to infect devices, at least as of the time of recording this video. I found this to be super intriguing since usually the public doesn't actually get access to any samples of real-life exploit chains as sophisticated as this one, so I had to take advantage of this and explore it further. Being an iOS hacker myself, I have a bunch of iPhones on all kinds of iOS versions for testing purposes, and so I decided that it would be worth sacrificing one of these to the spyware. I'm going to be using an iPhone 6s here, running one of the vulnerable iOS versions. There's nothing of any value on this device, so it doesn't really matter what the spyware decides to do. That said, everything in this video should be treated as for educational purposes only, and since we're looking at a genuine spyware campaign that is still active in the wild, I highly recommend you do not try this on any devices unless you are 100% confident you know what you're doing. Proceed at your own risk. The type of spyware that we're dealing with here is known in the cybersecurity world as a one-click exploit chain. One-click chains normally target the browser as their initial entry point, and that is exactly what this sample does. A user gets tricked into visiting a malicious web page, and the exploit chain kicks off by first exploiting the browser process, and then going on to escape the sandbox and elevate privileges by targeting the kernel, with the end goal of installing a malicious implant program onto the victim's iPhone. Before visiting one of the malicious links and compromising my iPhone, I first wanted to set up a simple man-in-the-middle proxy so that we can at least observe the network requests that the phone will make throughout this process. This is really simple to do, and it just involves running a simple tool on macOS and installing a profile on the iPhone. You can then route all network traffic through your laptop, allowing each request to be logged. Simple network debugging. I also connected my phone to the computer via USB cable so that I could capture live system log output. This allows us to view the debug messages that system processes are making, which can give us a nice insight into what is happening in the background on the device. So with this setup prepared, I opened the Safari app and visited one of the still active malicious URLs on the iPhone. Upon loading the page, we immediately see a few HTTP GET requests putting in some very suspiciously named JavaScript files. Then, just a few seconds later, we begin to see thousands of requests a minute to a bunch of other seemingly random URLs with show.html in the path. Not only that, but in the live system log, we see that the PowerD process on the iPhone is going crazy, making thousands of network requests. All while the iPhone UI is completely normal and seemingly nothing suspicious is going on from the user's perspective. So what actually just happened? In just those few seconds since visiting the webpage, my iPhone was compromised by a chain of sophisticated exploits, and malicious implants were installed all across the system, capable of collecting data and sending it back to the spyware host server. Let's break down each stage. The first suspiciously named JavaScript file that gets requested upon visiting the URL is a JavaScript file containing the initial WebKit exploit. This is the stage 1 exploit, and it's designed to compromise the browser process by exploiting some kind of WebKit vulnerability, such as a memory corruption bug, and leveraging this to gain memory read and write capabilities inside the browser process. I have a dedicated video on iOS browser exploitation if you want to dive deeper into the core concepts of how those types of exploits work. The exact details of the exploitation techniques being used here aren't exactly clear, and the JavaScript code that performs the exploit is heavily obfuscated to make it difficult for us to perform any analysis on it. As this spyware chain supports such a wide range of devices and versions, it needs to make use of different exploits depending on what the target device is. Running the exploit on different iPhones therefore results in different JavaScript payloads being downloaded and executed. The Google post claims that there are a total of 23 exploits covering versions from iOS 13 up to iOS 17.2.1, and it does a nice job at breaking down the details in this table. We can gather that for the iOS 14 version that my victim iPhone is running, it seems that the stage 1 exploit used is codenamed buffout, and exploits CVE 2021-30952, which is an integer overflow in the WebKit browser. If I was running this on a different device, a different WebKit exploit would be pulled, exploiting a completely different bug. Achieving an initial memory read and write capability in the browser, as these exploits provide, is really just the beginning, however. The chain needs to next leverage the read and write to achieve actual code execution by bypassing pointer authentication, requiring a whole other set of exploits. It then goes on to escape from the browser sandbox and eventually execute a kernel exploit, also known as a privilege escalation exploit, gaining memory read and write capability in the kernel itself. Each of the JavaScript files that we see in our man-in-the-middle data are these subsequent exploit stages, each containing exploit code and embedded binary files, again all very heavily obfuscated. Analysis of all the exploits and techniques used to deploy the spyware is out of scope for this video, as there is a lot of research still to be done, but let me know if that's something you'd be interested in seeing in a future video. As I mentioned, the spyware's end goal is to install a malicious implant on the device that is capable of harvesting data. Unlike other exploit chains found in the wild that typically spawn their own implant process in the background, the Coruna chain instead injects its implant code into privileged system processes. It's unclear whether or not this is a deliberate attempt to hide the existence of a separate implant process, or if it's actually some kind of code sign-in based requirement of the exploit to inject code into other processes rather than spawning completely unsigned binaries. Either way, the end result is effectively the same. They are able to run code with system privileges and access whichever files they want on the system. The first system process that gets targeted for injection is PowerD, a privileged process running as root on iOS, responsible for managing system sleep and energy preferences. The payload that gets injected here is coming straight from the second JavaScript file that we saw earlier, and is a dynamic library compressed and encoded directly in the JavaScript. The exploit dynamically extracts this from the JS file during execution, and with the system fully compromised, this library can be dynamically inserted into the PowerD process at runtime, allowing the attackers to execute their code inside that process. This explains the thousands of logs from PowerD that we saw earlier in the system log. PowerD would normally have no reason to make a single network request, as it isn't involved in any networking operations. This is therefore just one example of an indicator of compromise that iVerify lists on their blog. You can check for this IOC on your own device by connecting it to your computer, running the iDevice syslog tool, and checking for any unusual network operations coming from PowerD. The network requests that PowerD is actually making are to the show.html URLs that we saw earlier. According to Google, these URLs are used to download additional modules to be injected into other processes. With the help of Claude AI and some researcher friends, I was able to get my hands on just a few of the implant modules by extracting them from the obfuscated JavaScript and from some of the serving endpoints, so that we can analyze what they're doing in IDA Pro. Let's start with the very first implant, the PowerD one. By the way, if you enjoy this type of technical content, consider subscribing and liking this video to help the growth of this channel. Opening this implant binary in IDA Pro, we see we've got around 500 functions here with no symbols. Thankfully, however, these implant binaries are not obfuscated like the JavaScript code is, so despite the lack of function names, we can still figure out what's going on pretty easily. Using the strings as general guidance, I was able to assign some names to some stuff throughout the binary and identify some key parts. First of all, there's a function here designed to check that we're actually running on a real iPhone device and not some kind of emulator. It checks for the presence of corellium-D, a system process used on Corellium virtual iPhones. And it also checks if the device's serial number matches the string Corellium in all uppercase, as this is what the virtual devices normally have in place of a real serial number. If either of these are detected, the implant bails out. I would assume the purpose of this is to try to prevent researchers like ourselves from analyzing the exploit chain and the implants using virtual hardware with extra debugging capabilities, which makes sense as the original exploit authors likely want to keep their techniques private. Next, I found a function which I appropriately named cleanup. This function attempts to delete files from the file system that match a given name criteria. It's basically looking for crash logs from either the web content browser process, the PowerD process, or system-wide panics, and it's burying the evidence. This is a classic anti-forensics technique employed by malware. The exploit authors know that a key piece of evidence used when analyzing exploit chains are the crash logs left behind from cases when the exploit might have failed. These crash logs often can contain critical memory addresses, which allows reverse engineers to pinpoint the exact root cause of a vulnerability. By cleaning up after themselves, the implant is hoping to keep the details of their vulnerabilities secret, while also hiding obvious evidence that an infected user might notice in their diagnostics data. Another thing that this implant does is make HTTP requests, which we already know about from the Google analysis and from seeing the logs from my infected device. These requests are set up using functions from the Core Foundation library and are made from a few different call sites throughout the binary. We know that these requests are used to pull in other implant modules from the spyware server, and that this implant dynamically loads the new modules into other system processes. I haven't reverse engineered exactly how it does this, but we can see that the binary makes calls to vmwrite, a muck system call that allows you to write into process memory spaces. And it's calling this function with a task port that isn't its own, meaning that it clearly has access to other process task ports somehow. I would assume that this capability is coming from the kernel exploit stage in one way or another, but I haven't connected all of the dots. We see references to memory allocations, modifying memory permissions with vmprotect, and also a function called to pthread create from muck thread, used to create new threads in that target process. This aligns perfectly with iVerify's comments, where they state that the spyware will launch dedicated threads and dispatch queues with specific names inside system processes. So it's clear that this first implant's job is really just to prepare the other implants and inject them accordingly, and it itself does not do any data collection. The aim of this spyware chain is actually not general surveillance, which is commonly the use case for such sophisticated exploit technology. This is what the original Russian version was doing, however, but according to Google and iVerify, this new Chinese deployment of the chain and its implants are specifically designed to steal cryptocurrency from the infected device by scanning the system for any references to backup phrases or crypto wallet data. This data can come from the Notes app, Messages, Camera Roll, or any third-party app data. This main implant binary handles the real meat of this operation. The function setUp_sensitive keywords prepares an array of strings that match common financial and crypto keywords. This includes any reference to a backup phrase or a seed phrase, but also more generic things like authentication code, credit card, passport, and bank account. These phrases are then used in other functions, such as this one, which scans the user's Notes app and tries to find any matches. Eventually, any data that does get collected is packaged up in a HTTP post request and sent over to the attacker's server. Other implant components include a springboard implant, which seems to orchestrate other injections, and an SMS implant, which implements functionality to secretly send text messages on the device by calling into a private method send SMS with text. It's unclear why exactly the spyware would want to do this, but I would assume that it might be a technique used to spread itself further by sending all of the victim's contacts the malicious link. I haven't verified this dynamically, however. This is just speculation from looking at the static binaries in the disassembler. The silent and fast nature of the exploits deployed mean that there is effectively no way to tell that your phone has been compromised unless you go looking for clues beneath the surface. Both the Google and iVerify blogs provide details on various indicators of compromise to look out for in relation to this specific spyware. So if by some unlikely chance you are running one of the vulnerable versions on your iPhone, it's probably a good idea to check over these by examining your system log output and crash log directories. And as a general safety rule, just keep your phone up to date at all times. Hopefully this video has given you a nice insider look into how sophisticated mobile exploit chains are deployed and how their implants work. If you're interested in mobile security and exploit development, check out the other videos on my channel where I actually go into specific detail on vulnerabilities and the techniques used to build exploits for them. Also let me know in the comments down below if you're curious to see more videos on the different components of the Coruna chain in greater detail. There's so much to look at here, and so I'd be keen to go in deeper and analyze different parts of the actual exploit techniques used in future videos. Relevant links will be left down below in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.